Paul said that Israel, called of God, with all the great prophets, they were all Jews. They were all Israelites, one way or other. All these great men who were the forerunners of Christ, wouldn't you think they would be the first to know? He said, no, not so. They're blind. The Jews are blind. To this day, we know they get saved a little here, a little there. But by and large, Israel as a nation is blind. They have even got rules in Jerusalem. I read them in the Jerusalem Post when we were there some years ago of how to deal with Christians who try to get Jews saved, how they're supposed to be fined, or how they're supposed to be imprisoned, or how they're supposed to be expelled from the country. The Jews are blind, by and large, to the things of Jesus Christ. Why? Surprise! It's a mystery of the gospel. 2 reasons. It's not just, Paul says clearly, it's not just because they have rebelled and therefore their hearts have got hardened. That's true. But the Bible says clearly that God allowed it and put them on hold so that He could give attention to the wild olive branch which would be grafted in, called the Gentiles. And when the last Gentile gets saved, God will go back and give attention to the Jews that He's temporarily divorced from and see that they're saved. And at that point, then they will get saved. A mystery? Amazing. That's what the Bible says. Does it say that, Leslie? Look at point 2. See how fast we can go now. Israel's blindness. Romans 11:25. So turn to Romans. Romans 11, verse 25. It says here, read all of Romans 11 in the Living Bible. I'm not going to take time to do that. That's for you to do at home. But here's what it says in Romans 11:25. I hope I provoke you to much study after this morning. Romans 11:25. For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery. Now look this way. When a mystery is revealed, it doesn't mean that therefore we grasp all of it. We've been told the truth, but we're still working on understanding it. I would not have you, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles shall come in. And then, verse 26, all Israel will be saved. Go back to verse 17. And if some of the branches be broken off, using the illustration of a tree and branches, and the Jews were broken off, and thou, a Gentile, being a wild olive tree that originally in the Old Testament was to have nothing to do with it. Look this way a quick second, friends. You see, in the Old Testament, the Jews, even when they had compassionate laws toward a stranger or toward a Gentile and they brought him in, he still was to live below the privileges of the Jews. And to have a thought that God would produce not so much a nation now, although Israel's still a big part of His plan, but now it would be a kingdom where people would be equal to the Jews. Those despised Gentiles was such an unheard of thing that Paul's revealing it as the mystery, one of the mysteries of the church. Verse 17, if some of the branches be broken off, and thou being a wild olive tree, wert grafted in among them, and with them partakers of the root and the fatness of the olive tree, if you got salvation like the rest, like the Jews, boast not, that's us Gentiles, boast not against the Jews, the branches, but if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. It's the Jewish roots that's given us salvation. It's a Jewish book, it's a Jewish Christ. Thou wilt say then, verse 19, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Be careful. There's truth in it, but don't be big-headed about it. Well, verse 20, because of unbelief they were broken off. And thou standest by faith, but be not high-minded, but fear. Look this way. Don't say, oh, the Jews, they don't believe. They fought against Christ. They murdered Christ. But I'm a man of faith. There may be an element of truth in that, but it's because of a gift of sight that you got. And Paul said here, don't be big-headed about it. Well, he didn't say don't be big-headed. He said don't be high-minded about it. Means the same thing, as you well know. The end of verse 20, do not be high-minded, but fear. Why should we fear? It's a healthy fear, for if God spared not the natural branches. See what He did with His own chosen people. Think what He could do with you if you're not believing right. Take heed lest He also spare not thee. Behold therefore the goodness and the severity of God, the two sides. What He did to the Jews, what He did to the Gentiles. On them which fell, the Jews who rejected Him, severity. But toward thee, the Gentiles who shouldn't be in at all, goodness. If thou continue in His goodness, otherwise thou shalt also be cut off. And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, if they quit their unbelief, they shall be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. One more time, look this way. When Jesus comes in what's called the second coming on the white horse and touches down there on the Mount of Olives, and the Jews finally see who He is, at that moment the Bible says that a great fountain shall be opened in the house of David for sin and for uncleanness, and all Israel will be saved. But at the moment, not just through their disobedience, but through part of God's plan. Is it that God works with disobedience, or God just utilized their disobedience? We don't know. But at least part of what God's plan was this: the Jews will be set aside temporarily in order that the Gentiles, the dogs, the outsiders, Jesus referred to them as dogs, will be grafted in and they will be saved. One more time I should say this, but it's the human way of saying it. We ought to thank God we're so lucky that we're saved. Lucky's the wrong word, you know what I mean. This is incredible. We've been grafted in. But the only reason why we're grafted in is because they were cut off. Not just because of their sin, but because of God's plan. You talk about a mystery. Verse 23, verse 24. For if thou wert cut off out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, if you were cut off from a wild olive tree, wild by nature, and you were grafted in contrary to nature into a good olive tree, you came from the sinful Gentiles, and now you're part of God's plan when you weren't at the beginning, because His people were Israel. How much more shall these which be the natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree? Well, why then are they blind at the moment? For I would not, verse 25, which is our text, I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery. You won't be able to understand it all, but at least I'm telling you the facts. Lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, lest you become a smart aleck and think bad of the Jews. That blindness in part, so it's not total, some are being saved, is happening to Israel until, so it's not permanent. It's not total and it's not permanent. But blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles become in, and so then all Israel shall be saved, as it is written. You know what it all means? Look this way. Whether we're talking about prevenient grace or ex ex-ato, or whether we're talking about the wild olive tree or the good olive tree and being grafted in and so forth and so on, we're talking about God who is in supreme control. He never says oops. He never makes a mistake. He's never taken by surprise. What we do know is this, that all things work together for good. Whether it's God directly doing a thing which is good or making good come out of something that was bad, we never know it all. What we do know is God is boss, and when the smoke clears and it's all over, God's going to be on the throne, and we're going to be with Him forever, and victory will be ours. And at that time, though we've got partial revelation, we still see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. And we'll understand all things. So, I hope it's a comfort for you to know that you're saved because you were drawn by the Spirit, and I hope it's a comfort for you to know that God, at least in part, has said no to the Jews, temporarily divorced from them. What for? To give attention to replacing those branches from wild olive trees that are not supposed to be part of it, to be grafted into the pure olive tree, which is God's salvation, starting out as Israel. That means you. God's given attention to you and allowing Israel to stay blind until all the Gentiles who should be saved will be saved. Then He'll go after the Jews, and they'll all be saved. Not all who ever lived, but all who will be alive at that time, when they see Him coming in the second coming. Now maybe you're thinking, did I get out of bed this morning to come and hear this? I'm puzzled here. Well, is it not all right to dig into a few things? And to find out that behind not just the good, behind the bad, behind everything, God's going to weave His purposes. God's going to make it come to pass according to the dictates of His will. If it says you didn't choose Him, but He chose you, don't try to argue with it. Just thank God for it and rejoice.